Everybody, we're just going to that everyone can get in the room. Okay, well, let's begin then. Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. I'd like to welcome you to webinar 32 of the Digital Trade and Data Governance Hub. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Adam Zable. I am the Director of Emerging Technologies here at the Hub. This webinar today is co-organized by several partners in the US, EU, Canada, and India. So I'd like to take a moment to thank the Center for International Governance Innovation, the Open Future Foundation, IT for Change, the Internet Society DC chapter, and two institutes at George Washington University, the International Institute of Science and Technology Policy, and the Institute for International Economic Policy. So I am very excited to host today's moderated discussion on the topic of data sharing and emerging policy regimes in India and the EU to incentivize data sharing. And I'm delighted to introduce our speakers. First, we have Zuzanna Warso, the Director of Research at the Open Future Foundation based in Amsterdam. And we also have Parminder Jeet Singh, the Executive Director for Change based in Bangalore. Before we begin, I just want to encourage everyone in the audience to put any questions you have in the Q&A. I am going to try and leave plenty of time for audience questions, so please do post them. We want this to be as interactive as possible. So I wanted to begin the session by asking both of our speakers if you could lay us a foundation for the discussion to follow. Data sharing is a very broad term and concept. So I was wondering, when you talk about data sharing, when Indian and European policymakers talk about data sharing, what's the context in which you're talking about data sharing? What types of data are meant to be shared, and who's doing the sharing? So Zuzanna, if you could just start us off with some opening remarks to contextualize the subject, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, and thank you for having me. It's nice to have this conversation, and I look forward to learning from all of you here. So in terms of the European debate, and I have to say at the start that I'm a bit biased because of my background. So I come to this discussion from the human rights background, and for over 10 years I've been following the discussions, and I was involved in the discussions about the European digital policies from this point of view of privacy rights, of data protection rights, but also this is where the discussion about the data sharing in Europe actually started. So I'm sure you're well aware of that a couple of years ago, the EU adopted the General Data Protection Regulation, which was a belated update of our European framework on personal data protection. I say belated because before that we had a directive that was adopted in 1995, so way before the internet became as popular as it is these days. So in a way, the law had to play this catch-up game with reality. And a lot of attention has been given to ensuring that the personal data of data subjects, as we call them in Europe, that their rights are protected, that the privacy is protected. So this was like the first, I would say, wave when it comes to protection of data in Europe. And while the focus has been on protection of personal data, there were also provisions on data sharing. So, for example, there were the GDPR provided a framework for sharing of data in the context of scientific research, including medical research, etc. So, but at the same time, this was one of those cases where where the focus has been more on addressing market failures in a way, so addressing harms that have been occurring and have resulted from some of the practices of private companies who have been collecting this data and processing them. So so this was back in 2015, and what we are currently experiencing is a somewhat different conversation about data that we're having in Europe. But I think it's important to have both of this in mind. So right now, the EU is fleshing out its European data strategy. And earlier this year, it adopted a Data Governance Act. And right now it's working on Data Act. And both of these acts have to do a lot with data sharing. Data Governance Act is more about making publicly owned data more accessible, while Data Act is more about empowering the user to have access to their data. But also there was this attempt to make data owned by private companies more accessible to public institutions, but I'm sure we'll talk about this later more. So this is I hope this is helpful to set the stage for what will follow.
Absolutely, thanks. Parminder, you want to take the same question?
Yes, and thanks to Adam, Zuzanna, and others for organizing this meeting. Yes, so I'm going to take an economic perspective, and here I must say that though it's economics, we take an economic rights perspective, and we consider economic rights as much as human rights, as civil and political rights. I take an economic perspective to data sharing because data sharing is about the economics of data. And I also would take a new paradigm look at it. And this is how what I mean by taking a new paradigm look. So when we are too close to too powerful a thing, it's good to stand away and look at it from a distance and use analogies. So the analogy I use is from the industrial age to try to understand what's happening in the digital age. And when you look at it, at the core of industrial revolution was one technology whereby for the first time a machine as a thing was invented. And what is a machine? Machine is an embodiment of physical power, which before the industrial revolution was only with human beings or animals. They did all the work, but we were able to disembody physical power into something called machine, and that started a whole new era with cultural, social, political, and economic changes. I now fast forward to the digital. Digital, for the first time, we are able to disembody intelligence from human beings into machines. And when machines start taking intelligent decisions more or less on their own, we start a new era. So as the machine, as a disembodied intelligence was invented, here there's a disembodied physical labor. This is disembodied intelligence. And the question, the comparison between the two is that there were always found in the industrial age some resources which were considered infrastructural, energy, transportation. You know all those famous stories where the miners would have their own railway lines, and that was anti-competitive because new miners could not also lay their own railway lines, and therefore governments came in and said, no, railway lines would be a public utility. The energy grids would be public utility. So let's take the example of energy grids. The energy grids were supposed to be a public utility, and it was provided as infrastructure to businesses, industrial age businesses, then who innovated on the top of it. Coming to the digital age, data has a similar situation as an energy grid, and that is why they compare it with oil or fuels. Data is what enables creation of intelligence, and data of a society, therefore, should be looked at as an infrastructure. If you really read even the data strategy which Zuzanna is talking about, or the work in India, the term data infrastructures keep on coming. It appears that the big tech has become big tech because it kind of superseded the distinction between the infrastructure and superstructural activities. They became end-to-end, and therefore they became monopolies and the competition was removed. But if we now go back to infrastructures which are needed and allow digital age activities to take place on the top of it, things would be much better. It is in that sense, data sharing is needed, whether voluntary or mandated, which allows data infrastructures to be kind of a common utility on the top of which businesses then work in a more competitive manner. And the data strategy of Europe, its Data Act, its Digital Data Governance Act, also the Digital Markets Act, which has also very strong data sharing provisions, all talk about something like data infrastructures. Data spaces, which is at the heart of the data strategy, is more or less a data infrastructure. When they go into projects like GAIA, they directly talk about data infrastructures. So data sharing is about a new kind of infrastructure for the digital age, which should equally be available to all. And to provision that infrastructure, we need all those people who have important data. You asked the question, what kind of data are more important? So nobody's asking all data to be shared, but as it has happened in the Indian report committee, which I was a part of, they said any data which is considered to be of a public importance in each sector, and what would qualify things to be public importance is something we would have to work on, would be needed to be shared for making a public infrastructure in that area. Transportation is a area, or a health is an area where I can discuss. The new health data space regulation is a beautiful piece of data infrastructure development in Europe, but I would come back to these issues as we discuss these things.
Yeah, thank you. I would love to get into the health data space later if we have time. But thank you both for those comments, setting up the context. And yeah, so let's just continue kind of where you left off, Parminder. Whether I want to discuss if there's so much benefit from more data sharing. Well, first of all, what's the value of wider societal data sharing? Let's start there. Who are the beneficiaries and what is the potential value? Parminder?
Okay, I thought Zuzanna would go, but see, again, I think at the heart of anything digital, at IT for Change, we define something digital if it is intelligent of at least some level. And the resource or the raw material of intelligence is data. You can't be intelligent without being based on data, and you can't be digital in the real sense without being intelligent. So all intelligent activity, which is the basis of digital economy, works on data. It finds intelligence in data patterns. And therefore, from those data patterns, we are able to predict, do prognosis of what will happen, therefore what should be done. So the value of data is to contribute intelligence, which makes things more efficient, conserves resources, replace human work and provides more leisure. Whatever you talk about digital age is basically coming out of data. So that's the value of data. The good thing about data, unlike energy, is it's non-rival. And being non-rival, it looks like a very good candidate to be infrastructure, right? Still not polluting as yet, but maybe the way people say privacy violation is a kind of a data pollution. Yes, those things are important. So this is the reason data is valuable and therefore needs to be shared. That's the value. Did you already ask the question why the companies are not sharing it, or should we come back to it later if it's of that societal value?
Yeah, Zuzanna, why don't you take the question of just what are the potential benefits and who are the beneficiaries, and then we can get into the.
I think Parminder put it so beautifully, and on a level that applies to really different sectors, and is really like a universal value of data, exactly by providing this intelligence. And it would be tried to start enumerating probably the cases where the healthcare, transportation, etc. I think it will be better to talk about specifics. But I would like to take your question about the companies and why they're not sharing. And of course, there are these more obvious reasons that they fear that they will lose their competitive advantage, and which we can discuss. One of the other reasons provided is that they need to preserve the privacy of their users, which in many cases is a fair argument. But I think from our experience and from the debate that is still taking place in Europe, but took place over the last couple of months about the business to government data sharing, we see this landscape in which, so on one hand, there are few incentives for companies to share data with individuals, but also with public institutions. So there's few incentives. There are no, it's not mandatory, and the way the discussion about the Data Act is developing, it seems that it will stay a very limited case where companies are actually obliged to share data with public institution only in exceptional circumstances. But I think it's a very interesting set of arguments that is raised against data sharing, business to government data sharing in Europe, because we see how different, so to say, camps come together against this. Because on one hand, we have the privacy advocates who say that sharing of data between private companies and the government is dangerous for privacy, and it will infringe people's privacy. So there's a push against this. Then there are the business interests which don't want to share data with public institutions because, as I said, they fear they will lose some competitive edge. And then there's this mistrust in government in general, like that goes even beyond the privacy aspects. And I personally come from Poland, and in this part of Europe, we have it is still deeply rooted mistrust of government. So it's really difficult to build a coalition around this idea when you have so varied arguments raised against it. So this is how it looks like right now in Europe when it comes to the debate about business to government data sharing. So all in all, this creates a situation where companies really there's no push towards sharing of data.
Yeah, thanks for that, Parminder. What about for the in the Indian context? Why isn't there more data sharing happening there? Same reasons, or is there anything more to add?
Yeah, so see, the global dominant paradigm is global, so that those kind of thought processes are the same. So see, business is an actor which is maximizing its profits, and that's what the society wants it to do largely within a larger ecology, right? They have their business models, and the venture capital is paying them for their business model. They are not paying for some future good things, right? So right now they know data is the competitive advantage, right? So that's what they work around. Policymakers, and that's what we were doing in the committee I was a part of, we trying to tell them, no, okay, why don't you shift your competitive advantage to access to large hoards of data of everybody, and what you do with the data should be your competitive advantage. Actually, I remember a discussion with Google in our committee room, and I was saying, why are you afraid of giving X data? Because when you give X data, according to even a mandated data sharing regime, you get access to 5X data, right? And you guys, I was luring them to it, are actually more competent in making value out of data, right? Your competencies are much better, and therefore, when you really have access to 5X data, you really would outsmart other people, right? They all know it actually, and I myself say that the time would come that the big companies would ask for data sharing to be mandated, because they would be so far ahead of everybody else in their mining equipment, so as to say that they will say, yeah, let's open up data, everybody's data, right? Make it mandatory for everybody, because they would go to those pools and extract intelligence, and they would be far ahead from everybody else. So I think these mind shifts are not up to businesses to do. it's up to the policy. It's like a business dilemma, right? Everybody sitting in their own cells would act in a certain manner. But if you put together people in a system and say, well, what's better for all of us? I really hear in the private conversations very good things about data sharing. So that's why companies don't do it. And therefore, we need to elevate into a larger discourse. And now it's not only between businesses. Now each country is looking at the other country, right? If I bring a disruption in the dominant business model, we will lose out vis-a-vis, dominant business. So we are on one of those, slippery slopes. And that's where societies get together. And I think a lot of good work is happening in Europe. The health data space bill is extraordinary. It's a perfect data infrastructure. The Data Act lost its will midway, and I'll describe what I mean by it. The Digital Market Act actually says that search engines have to share data not only with their users, but also with competitors. The Data Governance Act actually enables, now if we join the Data Governance Act with the Digital Markets Act, and the Digital Market Act, for example, Uber drivers can individually take all the data back from Uber, and they can use the data cooperative provisions of Data Governance Act to put that together and really completely change their bargaining power vis-a-vis the Uber platform. So very powerful things are happening, but I can understand that policymakers are a bit cagey, but I think things are going in the right direction. And companies need to understand that you cannot have a competitive advantage on something which doesn't take so much innovation to do. Data, unlike intellectual property, is just out there to be collected, right? It's no innovation involved there. So you can't hoard a commons as your innovation. I mean, that's the old principle, right? We will allow access to the commons, and as a competitive advantage, you show your smartness in converting that data into new intelligence services and show us your innovations. So shift your competitive advantage away from data hoarding to what you do with data. Those are the kind of things which will take us there. And the last point, companies often say that innovation is affected. Actually, I have worked with traders, for example, on Amazon platform. Innovation is worse off because the data sharing does not take place. Those who actually manufacture good do not have access to the data about how people are consuming their goods, because unless they get their data, that data, they can't innovate. And the platform who has so much data and can use the data to make competitive projects is complacent and not the party who's going to innovate. So innovation actually suffers. So there are many economic reasons also for data sharing, but we can go on and on. But those all small things are happening right now.
That's great. Thank you so much for those comments. Yeah, I mean, let's just keep that discussion going, because Parminder just started talking about all the many things that the EU is doing. So Zuzanna, if you want to, do you have any comments on continuing that line of just what is the EU doing to incentivize data sharing, to encourage, especially in the context of businesses and businesses sharing data with the government? What is the framework that Europe is trying to put in place, and is it a coherent framework, or is it many different frameworks?
So, some of those pillars have already been mentioned today. So we talked about the Data Governance Act, which has been adopted earlier this year, and it focuses more on making the data that is publicly owned more accessible to other stakeholders. So it's not that much concerned with making the privately owned data accessible, but the act itself has some interesting ideas in it that can be very we will have to see how they're being used and how they're being fleshed out. What I mean is, for example, the concept of data altruism. So the idea of data donation, so on one hand, it's a nice concept that data subjects can donate their data for it to being used in public interest, but the way it's been designed in the act itself has been criticized that in fact add some bureaucratic requirements and burdens on people who would like to actually donate and share their data for public good. So It's a bit unclear whether it will be in fact a useful avenue to increase the use of data in the public good and sharing of data. And another idea in it is that of data intermediaries, so entities that can actually play this role of a neutral intermediary between data holders and data users, so and create some added value based on that. And data cooperatives, for example, that have data cooperatives, sharing cooperative services, as already mentioned by Parminder, is also in the Data Governance Act. And right now, the main discussion that is right now taking place around data governance in Europe is that concerning Data Act. And here we don't have the final text yet, so the institutions are still working on it. And there's a lot of potential in it in terms of data sharing and making data accessible to users and other private entities that make use of a service or of a product, while on the side of making the data accessible and sharing the data between private and public, like sharing the data, making the data accessible for public institutions. As I said, here we see this very limiting approach. So there is no real push for introducing the public interest commons, so to say.
Great, thank you. I just want to encourage everyone to ask any questions you have on the Q&A. I'm going to start asking audience questions. Please ask away. But yeah, Parminder, so for the Indian context, you've mentioned a couple of times that you were on this committee. The report that you produced, the non-personal data governance framework, could you describe how data sharing fits into that and what that says?
So, okay, I think EU has been great on addressing very specific situations in very powerful ways, like the Digital Markets Act addresses the issue of the platforms having data of business users. The Data Act goes and addresses the issue of IoT data, for example, of SMEs, small, medium enterprises, whose data may be collected by an application or a platform and how they get it back. And the right to repair data for individual users of smart fridges, etc. So they have been going to the specific problems and trying to figure out what to do. But the data problem is a wicked problem which needs to be also sorted out at a larger level. So if you really look at these very interesting acts and laws which are being framed in the EU, and you go to the legal basis, they're very shaky. Some of them are just because you have to have an internal EU market. That legal basis is important for EU, but nobody else. And then competition or public interest in general. Now, so when we sat in this committee, we were facing two problems. One, if you really look at the statements which accompany the release of, for example, the data strategy and the preambular part of the data strategy, you will see big exhortations about how it is going to be the digital decade of EU and how they are going to, more or less surpass or be equal to the Chinese and the Americans and all that. They start from there, but by the time they come to the actual language of the text, things really petal down. Because the first problem is most of the data is in the belly of the beast, so as to say, the big tech, right? So you cannot have data spaces around which whole digital strategy is organized without having a strategy to get that data out of the belly of the beast and fill the thing. So you can have empty rooms, which called spaces, but the spaces have to be filled with data, and the data is with those beasts, if I can say that. There is no strategy to figure out how would that data come into the system. So they have a very individualistic strategies. They think, on GDPR, they thought individuals would use data portability rights. Morning, they'll get up and feel like good citizens and say, no, I should take my data and go and put into data intermediaries because that's a good social act to do. Nobody does it. GDPR's data portability provisions are very scantily used. They aren't used really. Now they think the SME owners are going to take the individual data and, like good citizens, go and fill up data spaces. That again is not, so the individuals are not going, this is well known in social and action, that that kind of thing doesn't happen. So how do you get the collective data from the big tech into the data spaces is the big problem that they have not been able to address. With they keep on circling the problem, but they don't go to the center of the problem. Second issue is data is a resource. Now, resource cannot be easily transferred from party A to party B without a very strong legal basis. I can't just ask you to, I'm a poor person, why don't you give me your, whatever things to me because I need it. So law around resource transfers has a very strong legal basis. And none of the European laws goes there. And that's where the Indian committee report came out with collective data rights. The community of, for example, commuters in New Delhi are collectively owners of the transportation data which Google or Uber is collecting and has certain rights of saying, okay, Uber, we won't stop the primary collectors from using the data, but some kinds of that data, being our collective right over it, would be put into a community trust, which is then open like a data infrastructures to all others. So we tried to form a strong legal basis, and we went back and studied natural resource governance systems in other areas like traditional knowledge, natural resources like oil and so on, flora and fauna related resources, the Convention on Biodiversity. And we formed this collective rights regime, the only purpose of which was to be able to get that big data from big tech into the system. So that's been the effort. That's what the report says. The final report also has a draft legislation developed along with it. But there are debates in India. It's not that everybody has bought that idea. Even within the government, people have many ideas about it. But at least we have placed that, and it's the government of India's committee of experts. And we think that, one, we need a strong legal basis which can enable resource transfer. And second, we are very sure that in some ways it has to be a collective community rights also, and not just individual rights. So that's the directions the Indian effort has been taking.
Yeah, I think if I can add to that on the issue of perhaps the bit unreasonable expectations towards the individual data subjects about what they will be ready to do or what they will make efforts to do. I think like this is one of the major weaknesses of the framework we have in Europe. And this focus on individual and expecting that the individual will read every fine print and make informed decisions about how their data is used. And not to sound paternalistic, but I think there's it's a bit, so on one hand it's unfair to expect that the individual will take in all cases informed decisions, because that just requires the amount of effort that we can't expect every single user of online services to put into that. But at the same time, I think in terms of filling out these data spaces, again, I think we indeed need some other mechanisms and institutions that will fill this gap that arises when we create a framework that is shaped for individuals that simply don't have an interest in doing that. I mean, relying on altruism and relying on goodwill, on everybody being a good citizen is unrealistic. And I honestly think that this is one of the major obstacles, that practical obstacles that will have to be overcome in order for this system to work in practice, because we can have beautiful rules, but if the expectation is unrealistic and it relies on the individual making a decision and putting an effort into building a European data space, this simply is not going to happen, I think. And the example of data portability from GDPR shows that. I mean, there's also a problem on the infrastructure level because of lack of interoperability at some level, but it's also the lack of interest on the side of the data subjects to actually use that possibility.
Great, thank you so much. I want to turn to audience questions now. So Anne Froome asks, do you see new AI federated learning technologies by which the data stays at the user level and the AI algorithm models are what moves between the user and the data aggregator as ways to resolve some of the conflicting interests? And I'll just add also federated learning and other privacy enhancing technologies. Yeah, I'm interested to hear your thoughts on this.
Should I? Yeah. So I think I would.
Oh, you're muted, Parminder.
Sorry. So Adam Worm is very right. So we need to have technologies and law go hand in hand. And what you're talking about are federated learning and algorithms visiting data and data staying close to their points of generation is the model we should go towards. Because, you know, power is something like power corrupts and absolute power corrupts. The absolute concentration of data corrupts, right? So physically, if the data is close to the points of generation, that's the only way some kind of controls can be kept. And those kind of federated learning models, exactly what it is. Now, the problem is moment we translate into actuals, people dwell quants. Data localization is nothing other than, you know, keeping data at the edge, right? We say maybe data localization need not only be by the nation state, but also to the local communities. And I'm completely for it and basically saying yes to what you are saying, but the law should also go along with it. And I think the data localization and going even lower to, you know, data staying close to the communities is the model which we should work. Any good thing which gives good social results has certain costs. It's always been that, right? We can look at industrialization, everything. We try to make rules, we try to do things that increase costs. So we cannot keep on listening to this digital economy experts who say, no, this will add cost. Yes, of course it will add cost because we want it that way. So, right, I think that's the way to go, right? I agree.
Zuzanna, any additional thoughts?
No, I'm good.
Okay, let's see what else. Okay, we have another question about the health data space, and if that could be replicated in other sectors. I don't know if either of you want to talk about the health data space proposal and also the other data spaces.
I'm actually very interested in Parminder's thought on the European health data space because I think we were more critical about the proposal, but I noticed that you see a great potential in it, so you could perhaps elaborate on that.
Yeah, I'm aware, Zuzanna, and I think that's a good way of doing legislation that EU's GDPR, they call it some party or something. They are in communication with the health data space guys. They have raised certain objections and they're now trying to resolve those tensions. And that's exactly what is the kind of thing we should be doing. They're real necessities of our future lives and our current lives, like health, education, etc., which require data to be shared. And then there are the other sites where the people should come and let's say, no, there are privacy obligation problems. So the GDPR guys, some formal committee or something is in communication with this health data space guys, and they are trying to sort it out. And that's exactly how the law should be made. But actually, if you really read the health data space regulation, is a perfect health infrastructure. Almost all health data is mandatory to be shared, which be curated by public, but distributed public bodies. And not only primary health data is shared, that I go to a clinic, the example we know, and I can access the data about me sitting in any clinic but importantly, also anonymized data and inferred data from those grids is made available for researchers, but also to innovators, etc., using a very 20th century concept of data permits. I know how it sounds. There actually is something called data permits. I think that's a little ham-headed perhaps, but probably they fine-tune it. But you actually get data permits, and then data is allowed to be accessed only in safe processing environments of that public agency. The data is not handed over. It's like the same thing which was being spoken, the algorithms visiting. It's only the safe processing environment. Many of these concepts are going to be difficult to implement right now, but I think the ideas are all correct. So to repeat, actually health data space regulation makes a single health data space of almost all of EU's health data. Now, somebody has asked whether it can be replicated in other sectors. Something is unique about health in general, because we more easily accept that health data is needed because health is one of those primary needs which we don't argue much against. Second, in EU, much of health service is public, right? So it's much easier because the private health service is a very small portion of the overall national health services, which is not true, for example, in US or in India, where there's a huge amount of private data to be shared. So these are the 2-3 factors which have made this approach in EU in health data space easier. But I'm very sure we have to replicate it in some ways in other sectors. In transportation, it would be less. In, I don't know, education, it may still be more. In agriculture, there's work going on in agriculture. So depending on the commercial nature, sensitivity nature, the political philosophies of the countries, whether education is private or education is public, I think different approaches would be taken, but I think we do have a model there in health data space regulation.
Yeah, I agree with all that has been said. I think the devil here lies in the detail, of course. I think like the implementation part will be a challenge, and already some countries in Europe are saying that they won't be able to implement the law before the deadline, because of all the technical infrastructure that is necessary and that needs to be compatible with the requirements. That is challenging. And I think, like, on one hand, what you said about health data and healthcare being public in Europe is true, but at the same time, there's health data is one of those sensitive categories of personal data. So the concerns there around privacy being infringed and are even higher than in some other perhaps sectors. Also, the question of anonymization of health data is sometimes very challenging, and especially in the case of, for example, the rare diseases, right, where we have few patients with the same disease. So the talk about anonymizing data is a little bit more challenging there. So I think, but I agree that the overall approach and the ideas are good. I think what is the challenge is to put them into life and overcome these some of the challenges that I mentioned.
And just to add a line, and I think I'm not for this kind or that kind, but the way it's happening in Europe, the way Zuzanna is listing the problems and way the GDPR committee or party is now interacting with the health data space regulation is the way to go forward. Politics is about negotiations and seeing the public interest as best negotiated with many conflicting demands. And so I think this process which EU is adopting is very correct. But to answer the third question in Q&A, I think at one point they will hit the legal problem that's being talked about is the resource nature of data and whose resource it is. They have skirted that question. They've used competition law or something else. See, a competition law approach is an exceptional approach. Competition law says, if there is a market failure, I would do this and this. But when you're addressing a situation where it's not an exceptional thing, it is the thing, right? So you'll have to have a new economic paradigm of whose resource data is and how privileges and rights to that resource are allocated. That's what we tried in that committee report in India. You can say that some kind of data which is non-sensitive is collected as a byproduct of your other activities. You did not put any money into doing that, so therefore it has to be shared free. But there are other data in which there is an investment or there is a need for innovation. So like in intellectual property, land, and other resources around which you have to have calibrated rights, we need to start looking at the data as a resource and calibrated and complex rights regime around it. Now, this question of economic rights to data has been completely skirted till now by Europe. I think they have to take it frankly sooner or later.
Thank you so much. Parminder, I have a question about, so the Indian Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology recently put forward a new draft of the Digital Personal Data Protection Act. So is there anything in that act that any overlaps? How does that affect data sharing, if at all? And what other steps do you see happening in India? Is the non-personal data governance framework, is that moving forward? You know, can you tell us about that?
Yeah, see, this area is so raw, and knowledge and expertise is so still developing. In India, there was a personal data bill or personal data protection bill, and later the parliamentary committee said that non-personal data should also be included in the same. And there was a provision about sharing of non-personal data, but now they've reached this point, the new bill which you're talking about, and I just had a workshop on it 1 hour before. They have removed those areas, and it is purely now only. So there is a 4-way grid. There's personal data, there's non-personal data, there's protection, there's economic value. It intersects, right? Both personal data has protection issues, harm related issues, and it has also economic benefits, including to me. I want Uber to know where I stay, right? That's why my taxi comes in time in the morning. And same with NPD. NPD, non-personal data, also have collective harms related aspects and has benefits related aspects. But now they've again taken non-personal data completely out. In the case of health data space regulation, actually they have kept it together. There is sharing of certain even personal data in that, which is de-identified and shared. So I think that's complex, but the new Indian approach, the new Indian Act law, which otherwise I would say is a very, very poor personal data protection bill right now. It's been watered down. It's really not great. But to the question of, it does not deal with non-personal data at all. Government of India is divided in its view on the committee report, which we have given. Some say that let's start with government data sharing as they are doing with the Data Act, not through an act, but just through a policy. That's what we will try first. Develop the technical infrastructure for sharing government data for public sector, for startups and all that. And once the sharing infrastructure and thoughts around sharing develop, then we could also bring mandatory business to business sharing. That's around where current government view is, but they are now going to deal with this Data Protection Act in these next 2 months. And generally the timetable is that once they finish this, they are going to put their mind to the non-personal data sharing part as a second stage.
Very interesting, thank you. I have another question about kind of competition. And so some people say that the GDPR actually empowered big companies to consolidate their market power. And so I was wondering, how is there a risk that measures to increase data sharing allow and empower those big companies over smaller competitors and newer entrants? Kind of, is there a risk that that happens again if it happened the first time? And how are what are measures to get around that issue? Zuzanna?
I'm not a competition lawyer, and I'm also not an expert in economics, so it's a bit hard for me to tackle that question. But that being said, I'm not surprised by that at all, and it wouldn't be the first time when openness or open sharing contributes contributes to the consolidation of power. On a very general level, I think at Open Future, we try to tackle that problem, and we call that the paradox of open. So on the one hand, and we've seen that throughout the last, I don't know, 10, 15, 20 years, how open sharing of data on the internet, and I'm not referring to only openly licensed data, but basically making data publicly available, created this ecosystem where the biggest player consolidated their power. So I'm aware that this is a very vague and general response to your question, but on a more maybe abstract level, as I said, I wouldn't be surprised if open sharing didn't at least have this potential to contribute to consolidation of power. That being said, I think we should do all we can to avoid that and not be deterministic in that sense, and say that this is what awaits us.
I completely agree. Actually, we have written papers as critiques of openness of what is being spoken here, and digital openness has always been sold as equalizer, but that's not what happens. And we know with internet, the age of the internet has been an age of the greatest concentration of wealth ever in the history of humankind. Yes, Adam, you're right. The problem here is as follows, as I understand it. Europe is caught in an orthodoxy of the last decade and before, where industrial policies is not a good word. They try to hide their digital industrial policies behind social laws. That doesn't work. When they brought up GDPR, they actually said that our privacy preserving companies would have a competitive advantage, and therefore it's going to help our small companies. You are right. Actually, statistics show that GDPR benefited the large companies. So you have to separate your social law from the digital industrialization law. If you want to benefit your startups, benefit your companies, you have to make economic laws which favor them, not hide it. And they're now again doing it with the Data Act and so on, and I'll come to it if I have time. But most of these acts now have asymmetric data sharing obligations and powers. Whether in Digital Market Act or in DMA Act, the data flows in one direction and not in the other direction. The gatekeeper level, bigger companies are banned from benefiting from the data sharing provisions of all these acts, whether it's DMA or Data Act. So you have to put other kinds of conditions. For example, in India, there is a universal payment interface which does not allow more than 30% of the transactions to be done by any single company, right? So you have to do those economic equalizing or economic egalitarianism in a separate place, then do your GDPR. Just because GDPR actually helped the big companies, we shouldn't say therefore GDPR was bad, because I'm happy with GDPR. GDPR should be as it is. And if you have other objectives, which is to help small companies, then you have to have different laws and different legal approaches to do that. So don't hide your digital industrial policies behind social objective related acts. And EU has been very schizophrenic about it. So EU have to be bold and say, this is what we need as a society. We will do it. And this is our GDPR and whatever. And here we want our domestic industry to grow. We won't allow China and US to dominate our intelligence. And then this is our laws and policies for that. They have to be separated.
Yeah, I think that's a great insight, and I think this schizophrenic approach is even more complicated here, because on the one hand, EU has been at least in its inception, seen as mainly common market, right? And it was supposed to be an economic community, but at the same time, it has these social and fundamental rights and more political goals, although for me the distinction between the economic and political is really difficult to make sometimes. But that being said, so for example, we have the GDPR, which everybody considers a general data protection regulation. So the focus is on data protection, but it has to be somehow attached to an economic goal, because EU in general and in principle is about, you know, common market and economic goods. So there's this, as you said, like this schizophrenic approach when we on one hand trying to achieve social goals by enacting economic acts, and the other way around. It's just like there's this lack of transparency, so to say, in terms of what the acts are trying to achieve, and it's difficult to achieve everything at the same time, both social goals and economic goals for everyone.
That's really interesting. Thank you. We have time for one or two more questions. I have a question. How do we help entities better understand the public good nature of their data? Either of you want to take that one?
Zuzanna, you go first, and maybe I.
Which entities? I would say, like so probably the private business, right? I really don't know. I don't know an answer. I don't have an answer to that question. How to help businesses? I also yeah, is the question about what should be the role of the business? Should they act on for the should their objectives go much beyond the economic objectives, or should we have another framework that somehow takes care of that, and we do not expect the businesses themselves out of their goodwill to make in this case data available? There's this question about, you know, like for me it's related also to the question about the social responsibility of businesses. For me, it was always a bit tricky question how much it is reasonable to expect. Or so I'm more in favor of having a regulation that puts in place a framework that somehow creates mechanisms that take care of that, instead of relying on goodwill and awareness of private entities. But I don't know if that question was about that.
So yeah, so I agree. I think, see, businesses are ready to play as long as they play by fair rules, and everybody else is also playing by that rule. You can't expect them to do good when their neighbor is not, because everything is so competitive. So the idea is therefore how society starts looking at things as a public good. Even the worst of the businesses wouldn't do some kind of things because everybody agrees that's a bad thing to do. In that sense, society starts looking as data as a public good. And that's why I started with those things, you know, the railways and energy was considered to be a common grid. And mentally you start thinking that this is how, and therefore as a business, your competitive advantage is everybody will play by fair game rules, and there would be agencies which would apply that. And now the biggest problem with the digital economy is not within the country, it's across the countries. Nobody wants to make good rules because everybody is afraid they'll lose the digital race because the other guy has loose rules. That's what India is right now trying to do with the Personal Data Act, which is a problem because everybody thinks China doesn't have any data related laws and they are going to become super intelligent because they get all kinds of data. So it's global governance problem, it's a national governance problem, but the narratives have to change on why data underpins our common intelligence, common systems. We should still be a market-based economy, but this is an infrastructure thing. So those narratives need to be built more, I think.
All right, that's a great place to end. Thank you so much to Parminder and Zuzanna, and to our co-organizers and to everyone watching. Our next webinar will be next Monday, December 12th at 9 a.m. Eastern. Please join us for a discussion about Australia's news media bargaining code and similar legislation coming up in other countries, and whether or not that is a trade barrier. So I hope to see you all there, and have a great rest of your day.